And what I'd like to talk about is something a little bit provocative. The title that we settled on, Anarchism, Limited Government Liberalism, and Liberalism, a Modest Case for Sacking the State. And I wanted to be a little bit provocative, but a nice way to start would be with some definitions of terms. And then I want to talk a little bit about the sociology of the state and ask questions about what positive role it might play and what negative roles it also plays in social order. And the first point is to talk about this term anarchy. What does it mean? It comes from the Greek root anarchon, to be without an archon. So what is an archon? The archon was the person who in a war party was the first. That was the leader of a war party to go out. And we get other words have a common root, like arche, which means the principle or first thing, if you will. But the archon, when it's made a noun in this form, is a person. It's the person who's armed at the front of a war party. So we could say it's the leader of a war party. It's the ruler of a state. And from this we get other terms like monarchia, to have one archon, but then there can be also an oligarchy, having a multitude of archons, if you will. So to be in a condition of anarchy means not to have a ruler. It doesn't mean disorder or chaos, although it might entail that. But that's an open question. It's not an analytical claim. Unlike saying that someone is a bachelor, we know that person is not married, just from knowing what bachelor means. But it does not follow from saying that something is an anarchy that it's disordered or chaotic. It might be, and there might be, in fact, a relationship between the two. Some people have argued, it's a dominant theme in much political thought, that if you don't have a ruler, a boss, there will be chaos. And so we often associate anarchy with chaos. But that's on the basis of a statement about what people believe will happen if you don't have a ruler, a leader, a boss, if you will. So one of the questions to discuss is whether it's possible to have an orderly society without a boss, without an archon to rule over us, to use force to induce us to do what we ought to do or what the archon thinks that we should do. The next term that's worth thinking about is the term government. And British English is delightfully complex in a way that North American English generally is not, because you make a distinction between state and government. And actually in American English this distinction doesn't mean much to people. They talk about government and they mean a term that one might properly speak of, the state. And so when in British English you can say the government are displeased or something, using this delicious plural for government, doesn't make any sense to speakers of American English because they think the government is. And what they mean by that is the state. Whereas under British English it means the people who form the majority in the government, or the government, members of the cabinet, and so on. That comes from a very different root. It comes from the notion of governance, government, creating rules that will allow us to govern our behavior. And we can use this in the natural sciences also. We say that the heavenly bodies are governed by certain rules. We can talk about the governance of natural laws. Governance is about establishing rules. It's not necessarily tied up with the state. So we can speak quite legitimately in managerial economics and in business courses about governance, and also in political science, corporate governance. Whether the corporation is well governed, what are the rules by which decisions are made over collectively owned resources or commonly undertaken activities. But it doesn't imply that that's the government in the American sense of the term, namely the state. There can be all kinds of governance rules. When we think of corporations in contemporary English, we think of commercial, limited liability business enterprises. But in fact, the term corporation has a much wider meaning. Churches, associations, chess clubs, universities are all corporations. They're not natural persons. Right? They're not biologically individuated human beings. They are artificial persons, if you will. But we say that they act collectively. The members of the chess club decided to hold a tournament next month. Right? The chess club has done that. Well, that chess club has a governance structure. They have meetings, they have members, they have some principle that a majority has to decide when they're going to have their tournament or what sort of tournament it will be or who's invited to attend. So there are lots of ways in which we establish governance. We establish a set of expectations among the members about the behavior that's permitted and that they can expect from others. It can be about rules of property, for example, acquisition, access to, use, transfer of scarce resources, rules of collective choice, how the resources of the chess club will be utilized, or an association that owns a swimming pool, right? If they're going to have children only can swim during the day, or adults at night, and so on. They can also be procedural rules about how these things are going to be decided on, rules of order, rules of deliberation. You think about Robert's Rules of Order, very handy book that allow people to come together and argue, deliberate, scream, shout, but do so in an orderly way. Right? So that's one of the remarkable things about those things. They may establish place and time for meetings. One of the earliest ones I know of that's well articulated is in the Iliad, and it's when the Greeks, the Achaeans meet together in their war council. In order to speak, you have to be holding the speaker's staff, right? And then you can speak, and you have to switch it around. You have to be holding this damn stick in order to be able to speak. I remember when I had seminars on it as an undergraduate, we decided that was a good rule for the seminar. And so we had the pair of those Groucho Marx nose and mustache and glasses, and you had to put them on to make a point and then take them off and pass them to the next speaker. It made the proceedings seem much more Homeric as a consequence. So there's all kinds of rules of governance. And indeed, modern rules of governance that we experience actually have interesting medieval roots in the Christian church. Specifically, when you had Christian bodies, monasteries, nunneries, and so on, large groups of people who are not related, so they're not father and son and daughter and mother and so on, but they have to make decisions over collective resources, what they're going to plant, what kind of liquor they're going to make, a common decision problem in monasteries, what kind of beer they're going to brew, what they'll do with their resources, what the rules will be. And they had to come up with bylaws, corporate charters. And from this we get things like corporate bylaws for business enterprises and other associations to govern people who don't have a natural existing structure, the usual dominant position that parents have over their children, which still is common in families, doesn't work when you have a whole bunch of unrelated persons, adults living together and having to solve problems. So we talk about ways in which we govern each other. Now, the one that we call government normally has certain interesting characteristics. It's organized as a state, but we talk about it with the language of governance, about collective decision making. So one of the questions is, if we use the normal definition of the state, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, it raises the question of whether the state, or the government, to use the North American term, can itself be governed by rules, can itself be limited or governed by principles or rules, because the theory of the sovereign state typically is a theory of an institution that is above the law. It's one of the defining characteristics of sovereignty. In my opinion, it's a deeply illiberal concept, anti-libertarian if you will, but illiberal will do, the notion of the sovereign state, that the state is inherently above the laws because it is the executor of the laws, the source of the laws, and the highest body beyond which there is no appeal. Limited, we talk about limited government, suggests that it may be possible that there could be some principles that would be used to limit the behavior of governments. And one of the things that I'd like to address is this question of whether government and the state refer to the same thing, or whether we have in fact states which liberals have tried to get to behave as governments, which is not an easy process or tactic. There is something which, again, many sociologists who study the state find very puzzling, and I'll address this again in a moment. And that is that there are institutions that we now associate with government and the state that had very different roots from states. States originate, as I'll speak in a minute, in conquest and violence. But there are many community organizations, in German we talk about a Gemeinde, of people who come together to solve a local problem. It may be runoff from a mountain, from misuse of a mountain meadow that harms other people downstream. It could be some issue about flooding, where there's flooding, you get quite literally what economists call spillover effects, literally happen. And people need to have some way to address these questions, to internalize the externalities in some way, or to cause people who engage in negligent or harmful behavior to bear the cost of doing that. So I want to talk then a little bit about thinking about the state sociologically, because I think it's a neglected issue. And the first point is the mythical or magical nature of the state. And here we have a man who was just a professor at University of Chicago. I think he just switched to Harvard recently. Cass Sunstein, and he was just appointed and confirmed by President Obama to, I think, possibly the least harmful office he could hold, which is in the Office of Regulatory Supervision. Among all the things he believes, the only thing he and I agree on is he's rational when it comes to risk. And he thinks that some regulatory policy ostensibly designed to reduce risk actually increases it. So he's going to be a kind of regulatory czar in the Obama administration. He argues, in effect, that everything in society, and I have a little quote here from his book called The Cost of Rights, Why Liberty Depends on Taxes. You get the general thesis of the book from the title. He argues everything that exists is because of the state. Everything. That clock, your haircut, everything, your socks. Without the state, we would have nothing. And consequently, two things come from this. One, no taxation can be considered unjust or an act of theft. Even 100% taxation, because without the state, you would have had nothing anyway. And second, and this is a view that many people hold, Ronald Dworkin, who was a professor of jurisprudence here, also argued this view. Even other socialists found it implausible. Bernard Williams, that he thought it was one of the craziest things he'd ever heard. But it's a commonly held view among political theorists. But then, in addition, the more radical view that Sunstein advances is all rights are gifts from the state. Every right that could be attributed to you is a gift. It is what is called a welfare right. The state grants to you. So welfare rights theorists say that you have a right to housing, a right to medical care, a right to education. In California, they even think you have a right to self-esteem. It was articulated in a state law. So you should move to California if you want the state to provide you with self-esteem. That we have these rights to be provided to us by the state. And those are grants from the state. Most who have defended this have said, well, not all rights are like that. There might be some natural rights, and those are usually the so-called negative rights. The right not to be tortured, beat up, abused, imprisoned unjustly, and so on. Sunstein argues, no, those are positive rights also. They're grants from the state. And he has an interesting argument that goes roughly as follows. That rights that don't have an actual legal remedy, rights that are not in fact enforced, are not rights at all. It's a very radical claim that I think is implausible on the surface, but we can even grant that to him. He argues as follows. Even the right not to be tortured, which seems like a classical negative right, a natural right you might have, that people not just arrest me and pull out my fingernails and torture me and force me to listen to Gordon Brown speeches and other things like that. This is a natural right I have, not to be tortured in this fashion. He says, no, that's a positive right. Because in the absence of monitors to supervise the police to keep them from torturing you, the police would torture you. So therefore, you wouldn't have a right if the police in fact torture you. So we're agreeing to his puzzling and odd definition of what a right is. You have to have these monitors employed by the state to supervise the police to keep them from torturing you. So the right not to be tortured, in Sunstein's view, is a positive right, a grant from the state to hire monitors who will watch the police as they decide whether to torture you or not. But there's a big problem, of course, with this. It generates an infinite regress. To have a right not to be tortured by the police, I have to have a right that there has to be monitors. But specifically, I have to have a right that there be monitors to supervise the police, to punish the police in the event that they torture me. So far, so good. But do I have a right that the monitors punish the police in the event that the police torture me? By his thesis, only if there were Uber-monitors, super-monitors, who would punish the monitors if the monitors failed to punish the police in the event that the police tortured me. So I would have to have a right that there be these super-monitors. But for it really to be a right that the super-monitors punish the monitors for failing to punish the police, it would have to be super-monitors who would punish the super-monitors. The super-monitors failed to punish the monitors because the monitors in turn failed to punish the police when the police tortured me. So that's an infinite regress that's internal to his theory. And in fact, he's given us a logical syllogism in the form modus tollendo tollens. Specifically, if there are rights, there must be an infinite chain of monitors. There is, in fact, not an infinite chain of monitors. We conclude consequently there are no rights. So he actually has given us an argument for why there are no rights at all. But his view is if it weren't for the policemen out there, nothing you have would exist. And consequently, everything is effectively a product of the state. All of human civilization and productivity is a state product. And he argues also in line with what John Rawls argues, that in effect, everything is what is called in economics an inextricably joint product. We speak, for instance, if there was a kind of a screw and a kind of a screwdriver, and the screwdriver could only be used to screw in that kind of screw, and nothing else, could not even be used as a paperweight or an artistic object, then the joint product of screwdriver and screw, connecting whatever it is that they connect, would be inextricably joined, so that we could not establish a separate value of the screwdriver and the screw to the collective value. There's just the collective value of it. And then, if you're the screwdriver owner and someone else owns the screw, and you want to negotiate to attach something to something, you bargain as a pure bargaining process. There's no determinate price ratio for the two elements. All we know is the joint total product, but as to how much each one gets, it's purely a bargaining problem. It has no determinate outcome. And that's how Rawls can escape the idea of markets generating just outcomes, that everything earns a discounted marginal value product in a competitive market, and there's something to be said for the justice of that. He can escape that. For Sunstein, all of society is an inextricably joint product. We wouldn't know what anything was worth in the absence of your contribution or the presence of it. So it's just all up for whatever the state is going to determine. So the presumption is all of the surplus, everything that we enjoy in life, is made possible by the state. The state is attributed in much of contemporary political theory with astonishing magical powers. You can't even imagine the pharaonic kings of old aspiring to such incredible magical powers, because the state is believed to basically make everything. The whole world is in effect a product of the state. So we can ask, well, what is a state? And a useful place would be our good friend Max Weber and the classical definition he's given that's used in most of the sociology literature. Seems pretty good. from his essay, Politics as a Vocation, a very puzzling and strange essay, but he says many interesting things. That human community which successfully, interesting point, he weighed every word in this carefully, because some groups like Al-Qaeda is laying claim, but has not yet been successful to establishment of the state that they want, successfully lays claim to the monopoly of legitimate physical violence. Now that's interesting also. Notice it's legitimate. He acknowledged that there are run-of-the-mill freelance criminals out there who steal from people, but rarely do they act by saying, you have a moral obligation to give me your money. They just hit you on the head or threaten you. But rarely would you find a common petty criminal claiming that he has the legitimate right to extract that. Even they know they're criminals. The distinction is the state engages in the same behavior but says you're obligated in some fashion to submit to them. It's a distinctive kind of violent extortion of resources. They claim that they are doing so legitimately. And it's within a certain territory. So that the modern state, as we understand it, is a territorially delimited state. We could also talk about the nation state, but that's not what he's talking about here. He's talking about something, the territorial state. Modern nation states are also territorial, but the national character of it makes it a certain kind of state. It's not a defining characteristic of the state as such. There are and have been multinational states as well. The nation state, in my humble opinion, I think is a completely evil and vicious invention in human history that has killed hundreds of millions of people and has no positive characteristics. The nation, the idea that each state has a nation, and each state has one nation, and each nation has one state, has led to unbelievable human misery in the last couple of hundred years since it burst on the scene with the catastrophe of the French Revolution. Because you end up, if you just look at Central Europe or Middle Europe, the unbelievable suffering that was occasioned by this, because when multinational empires were broken up, there was a dominant nation in each one, but multiple minorities, each one of which was considered an enemy resident on your territory because they have another state that they ought to have allegiance to. Romanians resident on the Hungarian territory were enemies because they are really Romanian. And similarly, Hungarians resident on Romanian territory must have been enemies because there's the Hungarian state to which they would have a natural allegiance. The consequence was an incredible bloodbath, which was predicted by Middle European liberals in the 19th century, most notably, if you're interested, Joseph Eötvös, E-O with umlaut, T-V-O with umlaut S, is a really profound and interesting writer. So any of you who read Hungarian should rush to the library and pick up Eötvös's books. He also wrote them in German, so you could read it in German. And recently, his great book in 2 volumes was published in English. It has a delightful German title, which translates as The Dominant Ideas of the 19th Century and Their Influence on the State. I think the English title was like 3 words. Very English, but the German title was properly German. And he considered the nationality idea one of the dominant ideas, and he said this will lead to unbelievable bloodshed in our part of the world. He was exactly right. We can ask then one of the key questions about the social surplus that was so interesting to those who advocate this magical view of the state is how is wealth acquired? And there's a very important early French liberal writer. When I say liberal, I hope everyone understands I'm not referring to Hillary Clinton's political philosophy, but authentic, real liberalism or classical liberalism, sometimes called libertarian. You could maybe say libertarian is a really radical version of liberalism, various conventions governing this, but I mean liberalism in its older connotation, belief in limitations on governmental power, toleration, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, property rights, free trade, market economy, the benefits of peace as opposed to martial policy or militarism and war, and so on. And Charles Comte, in a very important journal, which was one of the dominant intellectual journals of the early 19th century, commonly read by Karl Marx, by the way, who completely mangled all of the ideas in it and ended up with an intellectual disaster, but he did read them. Comte pointed out there exist in the world two great parties. That is, those who prefer to live from the produce of their labor or their property, and that is those who prefer to live on the labor or the property of others. It's fairly easy to divide up much of the world. There are people who like to, who perhaps not like to, but who in fact live off of the work and the product of their labor, the things that they do, and there are other people who steal. And we kind of understand that's a fairly obvious distinction, but he argued that it was a way of understanding politics as well. The ruling elites of Europe were parasites. They were the descendants of robbers and murderers and gangs who took over territory, enslaved people, stole all their stuff, made them continue to work for them, and then convinced them that was the natural order of things, or that God had somehow ordained this to be the case. The state, ultimately, as Franz Oppenheimer put it, is the organization of the political means. He has a wonderful little book, Der Staat, the State, which is an extract from his typically Germanic, enormous, gigantic treatise, general treatise of sociology, which is not as interesting. But his book on the state is quite interesting and rich. He makes fundamentally the same way. You can make stuff, you can trade for stuff, and trade enhances value. Trade is itself a form of creating wealth. Or you could just go steal it from other people. So let's look at a little bit of the formation of the state. The first point is a logical point. Before there could be a state, there has to already be a surplus. The claim of Castanseed and others is wrong, not merely on economic grounds or historical grounds, even logical grounds. A state apparatus requires the existence of a surplus to support people who are not themselves laboring to produce wealth. So there must have been some wealth before a state could ever be established. Or you couldn't have people who specialize in the state function. That doesn't mean there has to be a lot. It's still open that maybe the bulk of the surplus is somehow to be attributed to the state. But the claim that all of it is cannot be right, and this on logical grounds, not merely empirical grounds. So if we think about early, let me go back to that one, hunter-gatherer bands, we observe no states among them. They produce such a small surplus. They can't generate a specialized class of people to do that. Similarly, in groups like this, the Yanomamo do not have a state. Surplus, again, is simply too small. We tend to find them among agrarian peoples. And in particular, the interaction between agrarian people and pastoralists, nomadic pastoralists. This is the mixing bowl, if you will, of states, is when these two kinds of people come into connection with each other. Agriculturalists who produce substantial surpluses, but then nomads, and in particular we think of the horse-mounted nomads of the steppes of Eurasia, this interesting Central Asian area from which so many eruptions of nomadic peoples emerge, going in all directions, and many of the great world state systems are derived from these nomadic peoples overcoming agriculturalists and making it pretty clear that we'll take all your stuff and we're going to kill you if you don't give it to us. There's a little memory of this preserved in the Hebrew books in Genesis. We know the story of Cain and Abel. It's very interesting. Abel was a keeper of sheep. Cain was a tiller of the ground. Right? There's this conflict between these two groups that's preserved in these documents. And you find many other documents also talking about conflicts between the people who are the pastoralists and agriculturalists, the people who till the ground. And the reason was these two groups would meet, one typically conquering the other. When we see the big eruptions of groups out of Central Asia using horse technology, military technology. Here we have a clay scythe for reaping wheat and grain and so on. This is something produced by agricultural peoples. And then the peoples who come out with either war chariots or mounted on horseback. The mounted horseback warriors relatively late in this process. Earlier, they typically came on war chariots. A war chariot is basically a peasant's cart, which doesn't have four wheels, it's two wheels that you hook on a yoke that goes over the draft animal, horse or an oxen. Oxen are not very useful for war chariots because you can't get them to charge. But horses, and they make it stable, and you can stand there and throw spears at people or shoot arrows. And this gives you a tremendous advantage over people who are just standing there, because you could charge at them, run over them, kill them, and escape. Now, the Middle East is, for most of the world state systems, there are other states, by the way, early states that were later destroyed, or proto-states, the empires of the Inca and Aztecs and so on, that did not have this pattern. One thing, they didn't have horses. But those states were later overcome and completely eliminated by states that emerged out of this process. So the world has been completely covered by the state system that has its origins in this kind of approach. And the Middle East has an interesting story. For one thing, interestingly enough, all domesticated cats are descendants of Middle Eastern cats. Recent genealogical studies pointed this out. Even my two beautiful cats here ultimately descended from those Middle Eastern cats. Wollstonecraft and Antigone, they're both robust libertarians, named after two great female heroes of liberty, Mary Wollstonecraft and Antigone. But those are long names for cats, so they're just called Wally and Tiggy. They created these systematic state systems. Mansur Olson, a very profound historian and political economist, described the process of going from roving bandits to stationary bandits. Roving bandits are people who would come through, often with their horses or other animals, steal agricultural surplus, cause a massive amount of damage, killing, looting, lots of raping, more looting, killing, raping, looting, and so on, and then move on. But one of the problems, of course, is they figure out that when they come back next time, the people whom they looted and raped last time are in a bad shape. There's not much stuff to take from them. And consequently, they find that if they settle down, they can loot and steal a little bit all year round. And it's not as damaging to the total surplus. There's more as a consequence to steal. Now, this may sound really monstrous, but in fact, it's a big advance. Much better to be looted and robbed in relatively predictable ways year-round than having people descend on you with no warning, steal everything they can grab, loot and rape, and then burn everything, and then move on. That's really bad. So it's better, in a way, if they kind of stick around and rob us, but in more modest fashions. We have a very interesting case of a historically rather well-documented state, and that's the Norman state. In the year 911, a Viking pirate named Hrolf, who had been participated in the siege of Paris some years earlier, he was given money by the king to leave. He took all of his money, then he attacked again later. These pirates were a little bit hard to make binding commitments with. And later, though, he agreed to participate in the defense of the realm from other Viking pirates by being made Duke Rollo. So from Hrolf, the pirate, he becomes Rollo, first Duke of Normandy in the year 911. It's a very interesting case. This is a state of the Northmen, the Norsemen, the men from the north, incredibly savage, brutal barbarians. They established this state there in conjunction with the kingdom of the Franks. And in about 80 years, they dropped their Norse language. It's a really quite interesting phenomenon. And began speaking this Norman French, derivative of Latin. The state here comes about when William the Bastard, William the Conqueror to his many admirers, decides to make his claim to the kingdom of England, complicated reasons having to do with the claim on the throne, the support of the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, and so on, and brings over his Norman knights, conquers the area, and displaces the pre-existing Anglo-Saxon hierarchy, and loots and steals and takes everything. And it's interesting, you can hear in the English language, very complex vocabulary in English, but a fairly simple grammar. English is not that hard to learn at an adequate level. I run, you run, we run, they run, she runs. Really taxing, difficult. Many other languages have more complexity than that. But English has a giant vocabulary because it's two languages that have been squished together, if you will, that fused. And if you listen very carefully, you can hear a conquest in the English language, violence. And one way to hear is the fact that English often has two words to denote the same thing, but they have different connotations. Makes it a very rich language for poetry. You could be thrown out the window or defenestrated. It's much more elegant. Elegant, classy people are defenestrated, but low lives are thrown out the window. And we have it in food. The general rule is, if it's on your plate, it's French. But if it's outside in the barnyard making noises, it's Anglo-Saxon. Right? Because they were the ones outside in the barnyard, and the people in the big castle were speaking Norman French. So we have for dinner pork. If I were to invite you to my home and said, would you like to come for dinner? We're serving swine. It doesn't sound very good. In German, it's exactly right. We are serving the flesh of swine, is what you say quite literally, for your plate. But in English, it sounds remarkably revolting and unappetizing. Or similarly, I could offer you a slice of cow, which is also off, or a slice of beef, which of course is French. So when it's on your plate, where the ruling elite is in the big castle and the fancy house, it's French. But where the simple common people, the ones who lost the war, are outside, it's going to be Anglo-Saxon. So you can hear this conquest, the foundations of the Anglo-Norman state, English state, British state, in that act of violence. Now, modern states have certain characteristic features. One that's very important and significant is they come to monopolize law. And law, in many societies not dominated by states, have many, many different sources. And even in the High Middle Ages in Europe, there were a multitude of different sources of law that interpenetrated the same territory. So even in the time of Blackstone, he identifies many different kinds of law. Manorial law, feudal law, mercantile law, royal law, admiralty law, and so on. There are a few others that don't come to mind immediately. There's all kinds of law that existed in Britain at that time. But now the doctrine is there's one authoritative lawmaking body, feature of the modern state. Parenthetically, this does not actually describe how real governments or states act. So take an example, which I know a little better, from American law, and that is that things like the restatement of the law of torts, the law of contracts, and so on, in fact, are not created by state agencies. The American Law Institute and other private bodies are the ones who formulate these. And they are nonetheless things that can be used in courts of law and can be cited in authoritative ways in legal cases. But they didn't come from the lawmaker or the sovereign. They came from lawyers, what used to be called in German lawyer's law, Juristenrecht. Now's the moment for that glass of water. And so there are a multitude of different sources of law But the theory of the modern state is the state monopolizes law. And indeed, this is the general tendency, an attempt to bring all law under the control of the state and eliminate other sources of law, such as church law or canon law. That was one of the other major ones I should have mentioned a moment ago. The replacement of customary law by imposed law. That's also a very significant feature. All social orders have sources of law, including those that don't have states, or that have states that are purely predatory and don't engage in law whatsoever. And this is, again, fairly common in human history. Customary law refers to the law that emerges out of the customs of people, the set of expectations. And indeed, if you think about the role of the jury in the earlier common law period, juries did not have the function of merely determining the facts of the case. The jury's function was to determine the law, because the judge would come through and say, what do you people do around here when something like that happens? And they would convene a jury to ask, in effect, what is the law here that would then be applied? And to this day, even in American law, although all state lawyers deny it, it's a matter of fact and law, juries are judges of law as well as fact. Judges will instruct you otherwise. You are only to decide the facts of the case. Did Mr. Smith kill Mr. Jones or not? Or did Mr. Smith smoke that marijuana joint or not? That's what you're supposed to determine, the matter of fact. But as a matter of practice, they can determine law. And the reason is they can nullify. They can refuse to convict, and they are not required to give an answer, a reason for it. And if they refuse to convict under the double jeopardy principle, the person is let free and cannot be tried in the same charge again. That means they are judges of law, and that's one of the reasons prohibition was overturned. Juries would not convict people for buying and selling alcohol. There's a famous statement by Jean Baudin, who is a theorist of the modern state, criticizing customary law. It's very revealing and interesting as a theory of law and state. He says, customary law comes in slowly. It seduces you. It comes about by the common consent of everyone that this is how things are done here. Whereas real law is sudden, imposed, and violent. Somehow he thinks this is an argument why that's better. But I remember when I read that, it seems clear that the second seems awful and the first one much better. It's gradual. It comes about with the common consent of most or all, and it's not violent. But his image of what true law is, it has to be violent, imposed, sudden, and violent as a characteristic of law. And customary law has not done very well in subsequent centuries. The claim of sovereignty. The theory of sovereignty, F.H. Hensley, in a fabulously important, although tedious and dull, treatise on the topic, defined it very neatly. The idea that there's a final and absolute political authority in the political community and no final and absolute authority exists elsewhere. That is to say that the sovereign power is the final and absolute authority. Whatever it says is the law, is authoritative, and that suggests to you that there's not possible for the sovereign state to be law governed, to be governed by any higher body of law. The process of creating a nation, the theory of the nation state, is that the state is the outgrowth, the flowering of the spirit of the nation. But the actual historical experience is very different. That the state causes the nation to come into being. If you think about even the French nation, at the time of the Revolution, only about 50% of the population of France spoke the French language. They spoke Breton, Provençal, Occitan, many other languages. Most of them Latin in origin, but quite different and mutually essentially unintelligible, or Celtic, or in some cases Germanic languages, as well as Basque, which still persists. Those were systematically extinguished by the state. And actual campaigns to wipe out these other linguistic groups, almost totally successful. And indeed, although there's been this pulling back, now they say, no, we must subsidize people to speak Breton and so on. This is not going to work. Those languages have been effectively killed off. I know the last generations of Provençal speakers, and their children who are my age do not speak Provençal. It's finished. This whole language is, this campaign to Frenchify the population of France has finally been successful in our lifetimes, to the perhaps cultural impoverishment of the people there. But so states create nations that correspond with the image of the state. This has been experienced all over, and not merely in Europe. You think about Malaysia, very similar experience, a lot of the Asian states and so on. The state systematically, through control over educational institutions, very importantly, monopolization of schooling, taking this over, attempts to build a nation. Systems of social control over weights and measures. I still bitterly resist the metric system in the U.S. I like the completely unintelligible British system. I have a feminist theory of that, by the way, which is that ultimately it empowers women, because anytime you want to know how many pinches are in a peck or something, you have to ask your mother. The only human beings who know what those terms even mean. How many gills in an ounce? No clue. Whereas the metric system is a typical male-oriented 10. I said the 10 hands you can slap people with, 10 fingers rather. That's my take on the metric system. And of course, compulsory schooling, the issuing of passports, and now let's think about the ideology that has grown up with this. Isn't the passport your ticket to freedom? With a passport, you can go places. I have in my office a German magazine ad I bought at an old flea market in Berlin, and it has an officious-looking border official in the train asking the smartly dressed couples from the late 1920s, early 1930s. He says, "Your passport, please." It has in German, French, Italian, and English. And he says, "How wonderful a passport is. It gives us the freedom of the world." It was actually made by the Bayer chemical company, which manufactured the materials that go into the making of German passports. What rubbish. A passport it actually limits your freedom. It doesn't give you more freedom. Passports are a completely modern invention that we have been propagandized into thinking are of ancient standing. So presumably Aristotle had a passport when he traveled around. This is nonsense. These are all invented in the 20th century, and the United States government did not even issue them until 1913. Why would you want to issue a passport? What's the point of a passport? The point of it is to control you, to make it clear you do not move freely where you want to, you move where the state allows you to move. But there's nothing in human nature that requires passports. In my own view, the sooner we get rid of visas and passports, I hate these things with a passion, better off would be. When I was asked coming into this country by a very charming and nice, whatever you call them, these criminals at the border, he was a nice man. He said, "What's the purpose of your coming to the United Kingdom?" I said, "I shall be delivering some lectures and talks." He said, "On what topic?" And I said, "On why we should abolish your job." "What would I do then?" And I said, "Presumably you're a clever man and there's something you could do that would add value to the world." So he's puzzled for a minute. He said, "Well, I'll think about that." But you don't actually need those people to move around. You don't need them to go to Manchester, although there are people who propose those sorts of things. And I should point out, in many countries in the world, you do need one to go to Manchester. In China, they have the household registration system. If you are not registered in that area, you could be in some trouble. You don't have a legal existence as such. The Soviet Union had the Propiska system, and Russia, the Russian Federation, still has it, and people of the wrong skin tone are systematically arrested, hassled in the subways. Go to Moscow, and you will see the police going down and finding dark-skinned people or Asian people, demanding to see their internal identity papers and their propiska. And if it's not a propiska from Moscow, they are arrested, which means they demand money from them. They shake them down for money, and if they don't pay the money, they're savagely beaten. It's a really very ugly and monstrous system. But when you say in Russia we should get rid of the propiska system, people say, well, but that's not possible. How could you not have a propiska system? It would be anarchy. It would be unthinkable. I was in Tajikistan recently and met with someone who was very libertarian friendly from the Chamber of Commerce, and the question was whether you should have your labor book, which is another Soviet thing that they still have in almost every post-Soviet republic. Your labor book certified that you were not a social parasite. Namely, you worked for the state, you had a state income and a job, and you had to hold the book, and it was a requirement for receiving your pension upon retirement. And actually, if you lost it, it's an actual physical thing. If you lost it, the state had no obligation to provide you with a pension. You said, well, I worked for 52 years. I said, you don't have your labor book. You don't exist without a labor book. I'll tell one other anecdote. I gave a talk many years ago at college in the U.S., and I was asked one of those questions that, to think about. I gave a strongly anti-statist argument and why we should get rid of a lot of state functions. And the young woman said, do you think the state should issue birth certificates? I never thought about that. I don't actually have a birth certificate myself. I don't exist. But I thought about it. I said, I don't see any reason why. Why should the state issue birth certificates? And she leaned forward because she had me. She said, how would you know who you are? So this is how deep the mentality could go with something. She did not believe you could have a personal identity without the state having issued you one. That literally your identity was somehow created by the state. When I applied for a passport, and I called and said I want a passport the first time, I was going to go actually to England to a program at Cambridge, and they said, right, we need a birth certificate. So I don't have a birth certificate. Well, ask your parents. And my parents died when I was very young, so can't do that. Why don't you have a birth certificate? I said, I don't know, ask them. I don't have a birth certificate, so what am I supposed to do? He said, come down with your driver's license. I said, well, I don't have a driver's license. He said, well, bring some credit cards. I said, well, I don't have any credit cards. And he said, you don't have a birth certificate, you don't have a driver's license, you don't have any credit cards? I said, what is this? I have to have a Visa card to exist? Why is that a requirement? So I had to get 6 people to go with me and say, that's him. And they filled out papers, and they gave me a little exemption, and I was able to establish I existed in the eyes of the state. When I had 6 people said, he's the one, they all signed, so I now officially have an identity. I'm so grateful. But they create all these systems of social control, which we then internalize and think that somehow they're natural. You can't move if the state doesn't tell you to move. You can't even exist. You can't have an identity without the state certifying it. But of course, most of the human race has lived without these things, and they had lives, they moved around, they had identities without having to have the state. Let me mention a few other features of the modern state that are interesting and unique. And one is the spoliation, or what modern economists call rent-seeking. Spoliation is a bit more of a 19th century term. It means the same thing. And that is the ability of the state to take relatively small amounts of wealth from very large numbers of people, aggregate it into relatively small benefits, into relatively large benefits for small numbers of people. And once you understand it, you can begin to understand how modern states function. So redistributive policies or regulatory policies often may impose small costs on large numbers of people. Think about the American sugar subsidies, for instance. There's a very small number of people in the United States who produce sugar, but they're highly concentrated in a few states: Florida, Iowa, Ohio, all those big square sort of states in the middle part of the country, where they make sugar by the least economical means imaginable, which is growing beets and then cooking it out and getting the sugar out of it, as opposed to sugar cane, which is much cheaper, easier, more efficient, smaller carbon footprint, etc., way to make sugar. But Americans have to pay about double the world price for sugar because of the protectionism to keep out wicked, evil Brazilian sugar, just tastes of Brazilianness, un-American, and the Caribbean sugar, and so on. The consequence is, it's just a little bit. Every time you have some sugar in your coffee, it just costs you another penny or something. But add that up, it's a huge amount of money for very concentrated groups who have low transactions costs. All the sugar farmers know each other. I don't know any sugar farmers. And I only know a tiny percentage of all the sugar consumers. So the cost of sugar consumers to organize themselves to oppose this are extremely high. And we even have what's called rational ignorance in the public choice literature. Most people don't even know that they pay more for sugar in the United States than in Canada, for example. They don't know it. Why? Because the cost of becoming informed is greater than any potential benefit that they would gain from becoming informed. So it's rational to remain ignorant of it. I am blissfully ignorant of the rutabaga regulations that no doubt cost me money. The almond marketing boards, all of the massive number of state interventions into the agricultural system that make my food more expensive. And in this case, the sugar case, it actually substantially destroyed another industry. Anyone think of which one that would be? That turned out it was less well organized. Candy industry is almost wiped out in America. Sugar, it turns out, who knew, is a major ingredient in candy. And so consequently, the American Lifesaver Company, if you know those little things that look like lifesavers, put them in your mouth, they dissolve slowly, are no longer made in America. It's a great blow to American pride. They're now made in Canada. So in effect, they're importing sugar into the U.S. at the world price in the form of lifesavers. A kind of indirect way of getting your sugar at the world price, but I don't know anyone dissolving lifesavers in their coffee. But this is found across a whole range of state behavior and explains a great deal of the modern redistributive state and the regulatory state. And I'll conclude with a passage from a great German liberal of the last century and one of the founders of the post-war German liberal order, called Ordoliberalismus, Ordoliberalism, Alexander Rustov. He wrote a great book. He left Germany when Hitler came to power. He and a number of others said, I cannot live in this country when such savage barbarian monsters have taken power. He took these people seriously at their word, and he left, as did quite a few others. And he went to Turkey, taught sociology, and did his research. And he wrote a great book which appeared after the war, which was an attempt to answer the question, how did this happen? How was this monstrosity possible? And it was, again, an extract of it was translated into English by his son and published by Princeton University Press, entitled Freedom and Domination. It's a great, very interesting sociological treatise on the nature of freedom and domination, free society and states, which he saw as largely predatory. And he argues that all of us have within us this inherited poison. As I mentioned, the case of pest ports, and in Tajikistan they couldn't imagine life without a labor book. How could you not have a labor book? And I was there with some friends from Kyrgyzstan, and they said, we don't have a labor book anymore. He said, what do you mean you don't have a labor book? We got rid of it. And he couldn't imagine that. what life would be like without the state insisting on this labor book. So we've internalized passports, labor books, submission to the state as somehow part of our being. And as he pointed out, it means all of us are, in a sense, accessories to this original sin. And it takes us being able to think through questions and ask hard questions. Is it possible to produce social order without violence and coercion? Is it possible that we can achieve collective ends without coercing people who don't want to take part in our collective goals? And I think that the answer to these are much more than most people think, and that we need to be able to sit down and challenge things that people take for granted, that maybe it's possible to achieve our ends without using force, to achieve collective goals even in voluntary fashion without relying on this mystically endowed, all-powerful state, which, when it comes down to it, is really some people pointing a gun at others. I think that there are ways to achieve social order without coercing or threatening or harming people or relying on force and violence. I hope that's provocative enough. I'm not giving you a lot of answers how everything is going to work in a free society. One of the unique features is I don't know the answer to that. Social order will always produce surprises, forms of behavior that were unanticipated, new kinds of order, new products in the market that no one could have anticipated, new technological, philosophical, and artistic and aesthetic developments, so that the details of a free society are unpredictable, which is why socialists don't like it, because they want to have a society subject to their wisdom and planning and so on. But there are many options for us to think systematically about how to do things without relying on force. Lastly, I put up some websites there that you might want to check out if you're interested in those ideas and talking and debating and arguing with them, with people from Lithuania, and, Italy, and Bulgaria, and Scotland, and Liechtenstein, and who knows what. IES Europe, which I've worked with for many years, the seminars in English and in French, various places in the continent. The Institute for Humane Studies, the IHS, the seminars in the United States that are really outstanding. They also accept British and other students. Cato on campus is worth looking at. It's the Cato Institute, one of the groups I'm affiliated with, has a lot of student-oriented programs, points out scholarships and other programs. And then one of the ones that I direct, the Atlas Global Initiative, it's atlasnetwork.org/global initiative. And we do programs in 17 languages. So we do some schools also in Arabic, in Chinese, in Russian, which we do in Ukraine and in Central Asia, Portuguese. We do them in Africa, in English and in French, various other languages. I'm skipping Spanish and so on. And if you're interested in any of those, and you happen to speak one of those other languages, we're doing our first one coming up in Hindi, which I'm very excited about. My Hindi is not very good, but I'm going to work very hard. That's not true, actually. I don't speak any Hindi, but we have Hindi-speaking colleagues who are professors, economists, lawyers, political scientists in India who will be teaching at that. So it's an opportunity. I'm going to move from behind here and sit down here, and maybe we can have a discussion for a while. If anyone needs to leave, my feelings will not be hurt if you desperately have to prepare for a meeting in the morning. Anyone want to raise anything for discussion? Yes, sir.
You raised the issue about productive members of society, unproductive members of society. I was just wondering about, is there something kind of vibrant about a society where some members, like for instance in the arts and in academia, etc., are necessarily generating productive?
But they are. No, but this is something I would begin by arguing against that. Adam Smith, one of the ways in which his economic theory was woefully inadequate was he thought that the only things that were wealth was the production of goods, and services were not a form of wealth. And Jean-Baptiste Say, in his treatise, Say is misunderstood as just interpreting Adam Smith in French. This is wrong. Say corrects Smith on very important issues, and the most important issue is exactly this, that in fact, services are the fundamental source of wealth, and material products are valuable only for the services that they render to us. For Adam Smith, if you stand up and sing a beautiful song, which you may if you wish to, this is not an addition to our wealth. It's just a song. But if you were to make a table, it would be wealth. And Say pointed out that's absolutely backwards. The table is valuable because it gives us the service of letting us put stuff at it, or sit at it, or write at it, or do whatever you want to do with a table. So that the fundamental value is the service. So academics perform a service, everything except postmodern departments of literary theory, negative service in my opinion. But the physics faculty is teaching people about physics and all the cool stuff physicists do. The medical faculty. These are obvious wealth, as well as literature. I don't want to make it just services. Literature, philosophy, art. And then similarly for performers. I would also add another point, which I think may be lurking in the back of your mind. There are some people who, because of accident, cannot produce wealth greater than is necessary for their maintenance, or not even enough to maintain themselves. People who are physically or mentally hindered in some way. And those are not the ones that these people had in mind. Those people generally are not parasitic. They don't have the power to coerce other people to give them their stuff. And they require love and charity and beneficence for their maintenance. They're not in a position to coerce it out of anyone else, as a general rule. Anyone with the power to coerce has the power to produce, and it is decided not to. Right? Every robber who holds you up at gunpoint, by the abilities for them to go out and rob you, shows they could be working in a store, or a farm, or a factory, but they're not, because they'd rather steal from you than actually go to that work thing that everyone else does. So those are not the people that the sociologists for predatory behavior have in mind. People who are unable to produce. And in any social order, they require the beneficence of fellow human beings to be able to take care of them. I would argue that liberal societies produce that in much greater abundance. And if you go to very poor societies, poor communist societies, you see people suffering from unbelievable physical deformities that in richer societies they just wouldn't suffer from, because wealth is the source of wheelchairs and prosthetic devices, drugs, and so on to make life better for them.
So just as a follow-up, so I'm just curious, what is the libertarian definition of productive member of society? So it's not just purely goods. So where's the dividing line, I guess, between the productive?
It's not a physical definition, right? It's not like how many grams something weighs. That's what the socialists think. And I'll give you just a digression. One of my least favorite American intellectuals, Robert Reich, who was Secretary of Labor under President Clinton and is currently a professor at Brandeis University. He once complained that the United States exports were falling. People said, what do you mean that U.S. exports are falling? It's not true. You go to the statistics and it shows that U.S. exports have been rising. It's just full. Of course, there was a dip, this recent thing that's not what he was talking about. But he was talking about, since 1968 or something, exports have been falling. And when he then clarified what he meant was, as measured by weight. Utterly stupid measurement of exports. What it means is, if you export a giant stone, it's increasing exports. But if you export a computer chip, what do they weigh? Nothing, right? Or a vaccine. How sissified can you get as exporting vaccines? But the value of exports goes up, because it turns out vaccines are actually more valuable by weight than stones or gravel or something. But he had this kind of dumb, primitive mentality. And he suggested also that it was more manly. Service economy is feminized. And of course, I'm sort of feminist in my views on this. I like services. I consume a lot of services, but they're like manly thing to do. It's the whole socialist mentality. Big, you know, the big muscles hitting things and all that social realist art. They're always this kind of oddly homoerotic Tom of Finland drawings of these people like hitting things and so on. That's manly. Whereas producing banking is like for sissies, insurance industry. So my view on it is not weight, it's not a physical characteristic, it's whether other people value it. It's subjective. And if I value your singing, then you've produced value. You're a net contributor. But if you come and say to me, Palmer, my singing is the most beautiful thing that ever happened on this earth, and you must pay for it. I say, well, you know, I'm tone deaf. I don't like your singing. It's not a value. No, you must pay for it. Then you're a robber, forcing me to. It's a bit like those people at the airport who give you the flower, it's pressed into your hand. You say, "Oh, thank you." Then they say, "Well, that's $5." Well, I don't want it. So you took it. I want it now. They're not producing value. That's a kind of theft. That anything that other people are willing to give something up, that's value. That's good enough. Yes, sir.
Why is the liberal tradition so more firmly entrenched in some countries than others?
That's a very, very important question. Some is historical accident. And one of the things that I think is very significant, and I was at a conference with kind of a sweet but dumb conservative, and we read main texts in the Chinese Confucian tradition. It was a great experience for me because there were these great Confucian scholars there. How often you get to be with the greatest Confucian scholars in the West at a small conference, and this one dumb person. And then we contrasted with Aristotle and his Nicomachean ethics. It was virtue ethics and Confucian and Aristotle. Sort of interesting. He said at the end of the conference, with this astonishing thing, he said, well, I've worked it all out. When you start with Aristotle, you get America. And when you start with Confucius, you get Mao. Well, like a lot of things happen in between. these contingent events. And he thought you just could plot the trajectory. Aristotle writes the Nicomachean Ethics, James Madison, Constitution, here we are. And that's it. And I said, well, you know, think about December 10, 1241. You know what happened on that day? It's a mean question, like who knows? I said, that's an Ogai Khan, the great Khan of the Mongol hordes, was poisoned by one of his wives. Presumably over a question of inheritance of the son. And they were going to make it all the way to France. Mongol scouts had already made it to the Atlantic coast, reported back and said, these people don't have a clue what's going to happen to them. And then the Mongols returned to the great Khans to Karakoram, which is in contemporary China, was at the head capital of the Mongol Empire, to elect a new Khan, and they never came back to Europe. Instead, what did they do? Well, the two Khans who left were left in what became Russia, established the Golden Horde, terrorized Russia, set Russia on this very distinctive path towards autocratic kind of states that they experienced after that. The princes of Muscovy rise up after the Battle of Kulikovo. They destroy the great Islamic kingdoms of the Middle East. Sack of Baghdad is 1258, not too long after this. They invade China, establish the Yuan dynasty, overthrow 1269 the Southern Sung dynasty, which was one of the great high points of human civilization. They invade and establish the Mughal Empire and destroy the Hindu civilization of the Indus Valley. And the Europeans are never invaded again after that. So it's an accident. This is a total accident. And history is full of these weird accidents. The second thing that happened that is kind of accidental is actually before this period, and that was when Hildebrand becomes Pope Gregory VII, 1053. And in 1055 issues the dictates of the Pope, which establishes this conflict between church, what we would call a transnational body, although the language isn't used. It interpenetrates all the kingdoms of Europe, and the German emperor claims sovereignty and superior power. They fight. Neither one can destroy the other, but they do something that is unique in the Eurasian landmass. And this, I think, is a distinctive feature of European civilization, but it is due to an accident. I think it's inherent in Europeanness as such. And that is that interpenetrated bodies are providing competitive jurisdictions. And so that the legal order that emerges out of this is not an order of pure predatory behavior, as most normal rulers are. You will do what I say or I kill you. But instead, it becomes much more like government. Because if this ruler is oppressing me, I can go to that other one. Right? If the Pope is oppressing me, I go to the Emperor. If the Emperor is oppressing me, I go to the Pope. And consequently, to achieve my allegiance, they have to pay attention to my interests and respect me. The political system, because of the influence of feudalism, which is initially a military system of defending against invaders, becomes highly decentralized. So there are hundreds and hundreds of different princes and bishops and all kinds of odd rulers. Look at Germany of 300 little principalities in a relatively small area. Become highly competitive. It means I can leave my ruler by just walking away. Cost of exit is relatively low. And the consequence is states become less and less predatory. Then you find the Ottoman Empire, system of Muscovy, and so on. Or the Chinese emperor and imperial system after the Ming overthrow the Yuan dynasty.
Also at the same time, in England, you've got the unitary state.
Sorry?
Also at the same time, in England, you've got more or less a unitary state.
It actually, I wouldn't quite say that. England has interesting characteristics because, in fact, it's not unitary. The system of parliament that emerges out of initially the king's council of the barons, who are strong men who support him and on whose control he relies, means you get the very beginnings of a kind of consultative government. You can't just do things unilaterally. It doesn't have the power of an Ottoman sultan at all, or a prince of Muscovy who does not rely on his nobility. Nobles of the Prince of Muscovy proudly describe themselves as slaves of the Tsar. No English baron would have ever said that of himself. And indeed, think about what happens with Magna Carta. This is not a unitary state in that sense in which the term is often used. In addition, the English rely on a very decentralized system of the administration of justice, which is the justices of the peace. And the justices of the peace don't enforce really dumb laws that will piss off all the local people, because the local justice of the peace actually lives there. He's not some foreign imposed person. We contrast it with the Ming system. When the Ming emperors established their system, the ideology, which still persists in China, it's very hard for Chinese people to think otherwise because it's so ingrained in the educational system, is the Sung were weak. They were weak because they were commercial and they had foreigners there, Arabs, Persians, and so on. We will be strong by being isolated from the world. And there's an ideology of isolation from which the Chinese are now recovering quite rapidly, and it's very salutary in my opinion. But what they do is they establish the Mandarin system in order to snuff out all forms of local autonomy. So you are recruited from your village based on the test in the Chinese classics. Very difficult. So they're recruiting all the cleverest boys, are being systematically recruited. You're brought to the center for training and sent someplace you're not from. Why? So you don't have any local allegiances. Your allegiance is only to the emperor. And then they rotate it out. So you go, because they know if you're living there for a few years, you're going to get to know everyone, how that works. So they move you to another place. another place, another place, another place. So that there's no local form of political association, allegiance, so on. But the English decentralized their administrative system very dramatically, and it creates a very different mentality. And the common law system is a system of customary law. It's not kind of an imposed system. It's a really complicated question that you've asked. And the answer is going to vary from culture and civilization and region, and often will include these historical accidents. So let's take one last one, the case of Islam, because this is an issue that comes up always among Muslim liberals. Is liberalism compatible with Islam? Of course, the Al-Qaeda types and others say, no, liberalism is Western, it's Christian and Jewish, it's wicked, not Islamic, mustn't have that. And then there are Muslim liberals, and think about someone like Anwar Ibrahim from Malaysia, who articulates his views within a robustly Islamic context, not very liberal. They are having an internal discussion. And you could identify several features of Islamic civilization that made it more difficult for Islam to develop, and I think there are two that are significant. One is the highly brittle dynastic nature of Middle Eastern states, which is not true of all Islamic regions, right? Because you should always remember, most Muslims are not Arab, and not all Arabs are Muslims. These are often confused in popular discourse. Different categories that overlap substantially. But among Middle Eastern states to whom, because of the Islamic heritage, the Muslim world has often looked, because the Quran is written in Arabic and the Prophet spoke Arabic, they look to that region as a special preeminent, highly brittle and highly predatory. And when they collapse all the way down to the ground, because it's a family enterprise. And one of the most recent ones we just saw was Saddam Hussein's Iraq. This is a family business, if you will. Well, everyone running, or his cousins, they're all Takritis. They're all relatives. The consequence is when such states collapse, they collapse to the ground, and all social legal relationships are renegotiated. So there's no legal continuity from regime to regime, no underlying legal political order that persists. Collapses, and a new thing is done. And consequently, no robust tradition of property rights, which is why you develop very closely related families. First cousin marriage is dominant in Iraq. So when you read in the description, I didn't know this, I was in Baghdad several times, I finally got it from people. I was with some friends, and we went around the table, and two of them we were discussing, they're all related in the most complicated ways. All of them were cousins in strange, but other than strange, complex fashions that they had to explain to me. And then two of them said, you know, we're the black sheep. We married outside the family. Our wives are not family members. It's an odd thing to say to a European, where first cousin marriage was eliminated a fairly long time ago. I mean, it's actually not that long in the big picture, but 1,000 years. But it's dominant there. And the reason is, it's the only way to protect your family assets, is to keep them in the family. So tribes are really very big families of related people. It generates high trust within the family and low trust outside. And it's very hard to have the institutions of civil society. But that was a reaction to the predatory nature of the states. The only way to protect your property was you keep it within your tribe. And then the other one is the central role of religious institutions, because you could dedicate land under a waqf system, or for any Arabs here, I apologize for bad pronunciation, but the system in which you've dedicated the land, the produce of which will go to support a religious institution. Secular rules didn't mess around with that, right? These predatory kings and monsters who ruled these areas, they didn't screw around with that. That once you had dedicated it was going to go to a religious function, they back off, because they didn't want the clergy and the whole religious body against them. But these institutions made it more difficult to establish civil society as a consequence. Then the other thing would be theological interpretation, there's a great conflict between two great philosophers. If you know Ibn Rushd, or Averroes, as he's known in Latin, he's a great commentator on Thomas Aquinas, and wanted to integrate Islam with science, again, thinking of the text of Aristotle, rational inquiry, and so on. And Al-Ghazali, who was Persian, who articulated the view that became more dominant, which is we don't need the science stuff. We don't need intellectual inquiry of that sort. All that is necessary for the complete life of man is in one book, and that is the Holy Quran. And all the rest is deceit. It's Greeks. Goddamn Greeks. We don't need them. And they're pagans, Christians, screw. And he wrote a book, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, and Ibn Rushd writes a response to the incoherence of incoherence, al-tahafut, that to respond. It's a great book, but intellectually, for some, he won the argument, but politically he lost. And philosophy came to be degraded, and not just what we think of as philosophy today means epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, and aesthetics. Philosophy at that time means physics, medicine, chemistry, all of the ways in which we search for wisdom becomes pushed down and intellectually degraded. And this has a very negative influence on Islamic culture. Again, this is a highly contested matter. But for each situation, there's going to be some different matter to it. Yes, ma'am?
If you didn't have any passports, would you have any regulation whatsoever on immigration?
I would not. I think that that's a matter. If you want to live someplace and you can buy land there, rent an apartment, you have friends who let you live there, that's your business. Now, it's also possible we have, or I shouldn't say possible, it's also the case that we have some second-best solutions. First off, passports do not protect us from terrorists. Don't worry about that. Terrorists get passports. They're very easy to falsify. There's lots of places where they can get you false passports. Ask me anytime. It's easy to do. And they're actually quite good. They're expensive, but they do work. And terrorists don't actually go and say, I'm Osama bin Laden, can I come into your country? They're smarter than that. So these things don't actually protect us from criminals and terrorists. They don't stop them at the border in that way. If you want to stop them, there are other ways to do that involve counterintelligence and infiltration of terrorist groups. They're risky, they're unpleasant, they're dangerous, but they work. The passport system is to make us feel like we're controlled, but it doesn't produce those positive benefits. What about people coming in to take welfare benefits, which is a major reason why many people support it. It's very big in the U.S. along the southern border. Somehow they're not terrified of Canadians pouring across the border, but many people are worried about Mexicans. And the claim is they're going to come and take all of our welfare benefits. The first point is that, at least in the U.S., empirically this is not the case. The welfare state brutally exploits immigrants, both legal and illegal, because they tend to pay higher taxes than they receive in benefits. So native-born people are exploiting the foreigner. That may not be true in Europe, particularly France, where they have developed a culture of come to France and get a bunch of free stuff. And this has generated a highly dysfunctional arrangement that is then used as a reason to stop people from coming to France. My view on that is the priorities are misplaced. Get rid of the get free stuff when you come to France mentality and replace that with, you want to come to France? It's okay. Work, produce value and wealth in cooperation with other people, obey the fundamental laws, don't steal stuff, and you're fine. You won't get free stuff, you can come here and work. And I would rather have a world without borders and passports in that way. Now, you seem very puzzled. Tell me why you think that sounds...
But if there aren't enough jobs, or if the people who come don't speak the language yet, then they can't work here.
Well, let's take that in order. Reverse order. We'll start with the language question. If I didn't, in fact, speak, Norwegian is not a good example because they all speak English, Latvian, and I go to Latvia, I understand that's one of those odd things. It's like, I'm not going to go there in search of work that requires Latvian knowledge. It's like going to Latvia for a good tan in the winter. It's not a place to go for a tanning experience, or Finland or something. So this doesn't seem to me a big obstacle. People will make that decision on their own. And sometimes you can go there and you don't speak the language, but you can do work that doesn't require it, and then learn the language. Go to factories in Japan. You know what's one of the languages you hear spoken on the factory floor? Portuguese, exactly. The Japanese who have, how shall I put this, profoundly racist immigration policy prefer Japanese people. So many Japanese went to Brazil, although they don't speak Japanese, they say they can come back because they're like those people. They wouldn't have Africans or other Chinese or other Asians and so on. So you can do jobs without speaking the language, but that's a decision for you to make. Just like applying at a chemical factory if you don't know any chemistry. They're not going to hire you. What if there are not enough jobs? And that's a question that I think reveals a view of what a job is that I think is at base wrong, although we hear it all the time. A job isn't a thing like a shoe. There are not enough shoes in the room for all of us. We could actually determine. Most of us have 2 feet, 1 shoe each foot. We could do mathematical matching of shoes to feet and determine if there are enough shoes in the room. Jobs aren't like that. A job is an activity of producing wealth. And anyone who can produce wealth can create a job. There's not a fixed number of jobs. You'll notice that the amount of employment goes up in every country that has rising population. Why is that? You'd think in 1900 there were only 80 million jobs in the U.S. But now there's 310 million people. So that must mean that the majority of them are jobless, because there's only 80 million jobs in 1900. But that's not true. Every baby that's born into the world has a mouth, which we often think about. I fly in airplanes all the time, so I'm aware of how loud they can be. They have a little mouth, but they also have 2 hands, which they can later learn how to make stuff with. So there's not a fixed number of jobs. In the market economy, the number of jobs expands to be equal to the number of people. So that, I don't think, is a problem. You're, again, very puzzled by that, I can tell. Think about it this way.
When there's high employment at a time that...
What is unemployment, though? That's one of the questions. It means that at some wage, people are not able to find work, and maybe people are actively looking for work. One of the interesting features is that unemployment is highly correlated with the size of unemployment benefits. This should not be a surprise to us. John Maynard Keynes understood that very well. I'm not a Keynesian, don't endorse his policies, but he was a very smart man, not as smart as he thought, but he did understand that one of the problems in depression was what he called the downward stickiness of wage rates. And that is an interesting economic puzzle. Why, during a period of deflation, for example, commodity prices fall quite rapidly, but wages do not. Instead, you see a rise in unemployment. It may be like a psychological problem. It's more easy for me to fire you than to say I'm going to cut your wages by 8%. So, but it's an interesting question for economists to address. He said that the increase of unemployment benefits was the worst solution to this because you're creating a voluntary army of the unemployed. You give people money to, in effect, speculate longer that they'll be able to get a job later on under more favorable circumstances or a higher wage. So you're paying people to speculate. So the question, what causes unemployment? I think state intervention is a very important feature in the creation of unemployment. And labor markets have clearing prices like anything else. And we shouldn't fundamentally consider them to be different insofar as people are voluntarily offering services. So unemployment is not an inherent feature of a market economy. And again, we find places with more flexible liberal labor rules consistently have lower unemployment rates than places with more rigid employment rules. Thank you.
This goes back to kind of the first question. I'm an astrophysicist, and as such, what I do is fairly unproductive overall. If I say I'm working with preparing stuff from guys with AGM guys, and what people label what AGM is. So it's really difficult.
Well, not educated people. This group knows what you're talking about, of course.
Yeah, that's even so. Most people won't know, and that's my point. You'll have very few people that will kind of be willing to fund my sort of activity. And so, in a sense, it's easier to do it through government than anything that requires force. So for highly specialized scientific research that cannot be done, I guess you can have a section that is funded privately by very rich people, and you do get that. But for my kind of research, what kind of solution do you propose?
Well, so what you're talking about is a case. Presumably, you think there's some benefit to what you're doing, but it's a kind of a collective benefit.
It's an intellectual benefit, and to those who are...
Oh, that's a benefit, okay. But it's a collective benefit, and the problem is to induce people to... So if you were actually working in a factory making chewing gum tastier or yummier or adding vitamins to it or something like that, that people would want to pay for it. We understand private markets would bring about, pay for you, that your marginal value product of making the chewing gum more nutritious would receive a wage as a consequence, and that seems straightforward. But what you're saying is that it's not clear that you can identify someone like the person who pays for the chewing gum, who sees the benefit, that then is, through the market mechanism and through all the different nexus of context, finally imputed to you in the form of your wage. Where's the person buying astrophysics, ultimately? Right? That's the question. And my view is that the first point is there's a constituency for doing state funding for astrophysics. Someone sees it. And I'm sure it's not because Gordon Brown is an astrophysicist. There's some constituency that induced the British government to pay for that. Who is that constituency? Why are they doing that? And I suspect that that means there's a constituency under non-state, non-coercive mechanisms as well. Somebody perceives something analogous to the chewing gum as a benefit that they're receiving from it. And there are many ways to produce such collective benefits without relying on force. I'll give you a simple example. So I do a lot of fundraising. So go out and have to raise money from people. And one of the things you can do is if you identify a group of people and you think there ought to be the kinds of interesting astrophysics that you do, comparing galaxies, specifically by weight or some other characteristic. But I don't want to be the only one who pays for it. I'd like there to be other people so that we don't have a free riding problem. I don't want to be the sucker. And conditionally binding assurance contracts are a common way for people to do that. Namely, there's a threshold under which none of the good can be produced. Turns out cyclotrons are expensive. You need at least some gazillion dollars to make one to produce that kind of physics research. If you produce less than that, you get none. There's some threshold effect. And so you induce people to donate on the condition that other people will donate, but it's not made real until you reach the threshold, the common pledge. Lots of charities do this all the time. You've heard of matching pledges. They go on the telephone, they're on TV, and they say, we've had someone who will match 1,000 pounds. Whoever gives 100 pounds will be matched by our donor. That's what's going on in that process. Churches do that when they have the collection plate. It's a very important principle. It's public. You see what everyone is putting in, right? And that is a way of overcoming the free rider problem. So there are lots of mechanisms for doing that. And they also exist in all kinds of research that doesn't have such an obvious immediate consumer benefit where you identify the consumer. Health and safety research, for example. Underwriters Laboratories does some of the most important research on very complex questions of product and consumer safety. Why? Why are they doing that? Who pays for it? Insurance companies. Right? They don't want to be faced with big payouts because people bought table lamps that electrocute you when you set it to the reading setting, for example. So they take these table lamps and I don't know what they do. Maybe they get dumb people to try to use it, see if they're electrocuted. You know, if you put your tongue in the little hole in the back, they say, oh, the dumb people were killed off, so we know not to allow that on the market. And it has a little tag that says UL. And I would never buy any electronic good that doesn't have a UL on it. Because if I put my tongue in the back of it, I might get shot. They're certified to be safe under very complex arrangements. Now, the consumer benefit isn't obvious there, but I am paying for it indirectly, but through an indirect mechanism that works very, very well. And even the kinds of high research that you're talking about, think about Bell Laboratories in the United States, it's all private. Some of the most important physics research has been done there. So, I won't say in any particular case, this particular quark or something is going to be investigated. But I do not believe, or I see no reason to assume, let me put it more modestly, that voluntary processes are incapable of producing those kinds of collective benefits. Because state processes also require inducement of political decision makers who could not care less about your galaxies to allocate resources. How was it that they were induced to do that? And there were all kinds of collective action problems that were overcome in the process of achieving that. So we just have collective action problems in one system or another. It's not a priori clear to me one will produce more of it. Yes, sir.
Could you tell us about some society as in the past, which has some elements of free society?
The one we're in right now?
Maybe a bigger one, so that we have, an understanding.
No, I don't mean the room. I mean the United Kingdom. I was able to walk down the street. Would you repeat the question?
The kind of society that you are talking about should be. It's quite radically different from what we see.
I don't think so. Actually, I think it's very much what we do see around us all the time. I engage in all kinds of transactions with other people today, and as far as I know, I did not use violence against anyone or coerce them. I bought some strange English breakfast that looked like an animal had died on my plate. Fry-up thing that they call all the dead tomatoes and everything. And we exchanged it, and the tomato farmers were part of this process, and so on. It was all quite orderly and peaceful. It's true that some of the transportation I traveled on was state managed, but it doesn't have to be. So I think we see the principles of freedom just all around us. Every time we have a conversation with someone, we're engaging in a fundamental act of a free society, which is a peaceful interchange with people. I think your question, though, is there a society in which there's no coercion at all? And I think the answer is no. But there are societies in which there's more and less. And less is better. We're fairly straightforward about that. But there are many political ideologies that disagree with that fundamentally. They think that coercion and power is a part of the right ordering of society. Extreme cases like the Juche philosophy in North Korea. Whole country terrorized by a small group of completely insane people. And the Kim Jong-il is also equally insane father. Or Romania under the Ceausescu's, or extremist regimes of the radical Islamist sort in Sudan at some point and so on. There are a lot of people who disagree with this. They think that if you're not of the same religion with me, don't have the same sexual orientation, don't speak the same language, that we should kill each other. Right? And a lot of people think that. Liberalism is a rejection of that. It says that one person can go to a mosque, a neighbor goes to a temple, another one goes to a synagogue, another one goes to a church, someone else goes to the pub, and they all live together peacefully. That's a free society. And we substantially see that in many countries, but not all countries of the world. Can you have a legal order without a state? It's a sort of deeper question. Because even here in the UK, there's a state, and we rely on it. We expect it to protect us. That if I were to be beaten up, which happened to me several times in Oxford, in theory, I could ask the local police to protect me. I was quite savagely beaten with a bicycle smashed in the back of my head. Turns out it's a very effective way to incapacitate people. And then they grabbed my tie and kicked me with those big hobnail boots in the face for a long time. And when they were finally done, and you can't fight when your tie is grabbed like that. So I don't like to wear ties in dark alleys. Then I went to the local pub or whatever it was, the Lamb and Flag or something, and asked them if I could have some paper towels with blood and broken lip. And the fellow said, "Has something happened?" I said, "No, I always look like this." My normal appeals had tie all smashed up and torn shirt and blood. He didn't appreciate my attitude. And the police came and said, "Thank you for the information. There's nothing we can do. They've been beating people up, and that's how life is here." But in theory, they would have caught them and would have protected me from them. They didn't. It's sort of their job. But let's look at how this can be provided in other ways. Let's take the case of the United States. Many people are shocked to learn that the police do not catch criminals. They don't. Nor do the police prevent crime. They don't do that either. I am armed. I had a case in the Supreme Court and won the right to keep and bear arms. No one fucks with me because I'm armed and I know how to use it, and I tend not to be beaten up or killed. What the police can do is not protect you. They can come and take a picture of your corpse, which they're pretty good at, and they make a report, and then it gets filed, and then nothing happens. That's your typical police case. Who actually catches most of the criminals once they've identified a person and issued a warrant? Does anyone know? Bounty hunters. Shocking. I mean, that sounds scary, because bounty hunters, we know, are these scary, weird people. Some of them have on TV. All the bounty hunters on TV are weird people with tattoos and piercings and so on. But real bounty hunters aren't. What they do is they enforce the law, but they are private persons. And the great majority of fugitives from justice are caught by bounty hunters, not by the agents of the state. The bounty hunters go and catch you, and because they're private persons, they have no sovereign immunity. You know, sovereign immunity is the principle that the state cannot be sued unless it agrees to be sued. Right? So it's difficult to do that. It can be done if you can induce one part of the state to allow another part to be sued. But police officers have a kind of immunity in law. So if a policeman shoots you, you know what happens to him? He gets 6 weeks paid vacation while they investigate. Nothing bad happens to him. Every police officer I've ever known, and they do this in the UK too, carries what's called a throwdown knife. You know what a throwdown knife is? It's a knife you carry in your boot. If you end up shooting someone, you say he had a knife. And you put it down and put his finger in it. He said he had a knife. Presumption was, it's okay. That's common. Bounty hunters can't do that because they will be prosecuted for excessive use of force. So they have to bring the fugitive in one whole integrated functional piece to the court of law to get their payment. If they bring a dead body or several parts, they get no money. They're not used So we have an actual law enforcement procedure that is more law-governed than the police, who are A, ineffective and useless, and B, extremely violent and dangerous. There are 3 times as many private police officers in the U.S. as there are government police officers. How many private police officers kill people in the course of a year? On average, less than 1. Contrast that with the Los Angeles Police Department, which kills at least 1 person a day. And that's just in Los Angeles. They're violent. They enforce victimless crime laws. Private police agents do not enforce victimless crime laws. Private security guards at malls do not get together at night and smash down your door and say, "You are smoking marijuana." They don't do that. So we have a very effective system to enforce law in the sense of allowing people to live together freely, versus the state police who don't actually achieve that. They're just not very effective at it. So could we have elimination of state police and have private enforcement of justice instead? And I think the answer is yes. We already do have it. We live with it. It's part of our lives. We just are so accustomed to the mythology of the state that we assume the reason shopping malls are secure is because of the state police. It's not. It's secure because the merchants don't want trouble there, and they secure the area themselves. There have been stateless societies that have been pretty effective for their time. Iceland, from the period of the founding in 830 between 1242 and 1244, was a stateless commonwealth. They had no state. They had a common legislature called the All Thing, quite literal-minded, the Icelanders, just the All Thing. Each person was a member of a thing, it's a lovely term, which was a law enforcement body with what's called Godli, which is the chieftain. And the Godli thingman relationship is a voluntary consensual arrangement. It was not based on family or geography. They interpenetrated the area, and they produced legal order. It was, for each day, a very law-governed society, very peaceful, the least war-oriented, most peaceful society in Europe of its day. If you raise these questions, people laugh at you and say, "So you want us to live in medieval Iceland?" No, life really sunk in medieval Iceland. But it sunk more everywhere else. So it does tell us a little bit about how voluntary arrangements can function. And the fact is, we actually see them today around us. There's lots of them. So I'm not proposing a utopia. I'm just saying, let's look at the world and how it works and see if we can have a little more of it. I see your hand up next.
Do you suppose it's in a state-free society, people in general
Yes, sir.
would be more, in a state-free society, do you suppose that people in general would be more responsible? A lot of people now just tend to either shove things up or assume the government will do it for them.
Well, let's think about that. I don't assume that there will be a change in human psychology. There's the kind of Marxist fantasies. Everyone will become a better person. Let's just assume people are just as malicious and wicked as they are now. Which is rare. But the question is, are we able to force other people to subsidize our irresponsibility? And we have a very good example of that, the current financial crisis. Banks are systematically both coerced and subsidized in the United States to engage in more and more risky behavior, to lower lending standards. The social policy of the Clinton and Bush administrations, so it's not one party or the other, all politicians did this, increase home ownership, the American dream as they call it. Somehow renting is bad. Home ownership is real, which I think is crazy. But they wanted to push more and more people to be owners. How do you do that? You have to force or subsidize banks to lower lending standards. And this is what happened. And we ended up with the so-called toxic mortgages, these non-performing mortgages, issued to university students with no jobs and no money down, a 0% down payment, 100% home loan to people who didn't have jobs. You think, oh, what's going to happen now? All right? If you find you can't pay, what are you going to do? You're going to walk away. Same as, because you have no assets tied up. So all the traditional patterns of inducing people to behave responsibly were systematically undermined. And this is not just a theory. This is extremely well documented. For people to engage in risky behavior, excessive risk. Mortgages that never would have been written under normal banking conditions. Not to mention 2.5 years of the federal funds rate, which is the overnight lending rate that the Federal Reserve offers to member banks, were negative. What happens when the interest rates are negative? Just think. It means the bank is paying you to borrow, which is unusual. It's never happened in my life. But if the bank paid me to borrow, I think I would borrow more, which is what happened. So you get all this cheap, easy credit flooding into the market and systematically pushed into distorting the housing market. So we have had lots of subsidized foolish behavior, and people engaged in more of it. If the cost of your behavior redounded to yourself, you wouldn't have taxpayer bailouts, people would behave more reasonably. But the moral hazard problem, you know, moral hazard is an asymmetry of information between two parties, but normally we cash it out in the form of the knowledge that once you get insurance for everything, you're going to do more skydiving. You know, you're insured now. And the insurance companies know that, so they're going to try and monitor your behavior in such a way that they're not inducing you to take more risks by insuring you. It's a complex dynamic between persons. But what we've had is a systematic creation of moral hazard in a huge range of different kinds of behavior. And people behave less responsibly as a consequence. So I think people would be more responsible if they were unable to make other people clean up their messes. That's a modest way of putting it. But I don't think it would transform human nature, which is the kind of, these are utopian fantasies. Colors would be brighter, everything would taste better, sex would be amazing. If only we had whatever institution it is that would accomplish socialism or maybe anarchism or something would transform human nature. It's not going to happen. But if I'm unable to externalize the cost of my behavior, I will behave more responsibly. And I'll still have the same nature and still be the same bastard I am now. But I will be less likely to behave in an irresponsible fashion. Does that answer the question? You had some particular.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Oh yeah, I was just wondering how you respond to the two typical arguments against the total free market ideology that number one, it frightens inequality excessively, and number two, kind of corollary that thus we need like some sort of a social.
What were your last thing, sir?
Oh, kind of a corollary to that is that we need like a social safety net, i.e., welfare, social security, etc.
The first point's an empirical claim, or it's a contingent claim, right? That's a very important point. You hear it said all the time, the market creates more inequality. In my opinion, I'm old-fashioned. I want to say, you made a claim. Is there any evidence for it? You never get it. Turns out when you look for the evidence, it isn't true. When you actually look at available statistical data that might allow us to measure these things. And I'll give you an interesting example of that. And you hear, you go into the political theory discussions at Oxford, they all say, markets equal inequality, socialism equals equality. I made the mistake of saying, is that true? They looked at me like I had just, what is wrong with you? It's just, these are analytically true statements. And I said, I used to spend a lot of time with the Soviet Union. There was massive inequality. The hard currency shops that only party members could shop at, or the scum from the KGB and the security apparatus that had access to German or American money. The inequality is staggering there. What do you mean socialism means equality? Does? Duh. Well, I think it's an empirical question. The Fraser Institute of Canada does a report every year on economic freedom of the world, attempting to quantify and measure and compare what they call economic freedom, ability to transact freely without stipulations or controls or restrictions, freedom of trade, trade barriers, general burden of the state, transparency, low transactions costs, legal system, and so on. There's a very open set of metrics. All the methods is laid out for anyone to examine, and they use only publicly available data, so they don't do their own surveys and pooling, not because they're not competent at it, but they say, we don't want anyone to question our data we use. World Bank, United Nations, World Health Organization, OECD, etc. data. One of the things that they found, which was really quite striking, was if you look at the lowest decile of income earners, the lowest 10% of population, what percent of national income goes to them? One interesting measure of inequality. It turns out if you separate into 4 or 5, doesn't matter, categories of economically free, from the least free to the most free, the percentage of national income accruing to the lowest decile is almost the same. It seems highly immune to the degree of economic freedom, that is to say, how free market it is, more or less. It's about 2.5%. It fluctuates a little bit. It's slightly higher, consistently so, but not in a statistically meaningful sense, at the highest economic freedom, so the highest quintile, highest 20%, slightly more, but just tiny difference. So the inequality measure doesn't seem to be very dramatic. However, the level of income is massively different. We're talking about a couple $1,000s a year versus $17,000. That's a big difference in living standard, the ability to get medicine for your children, eyeglasses if you have reading problems, all the things that we take for granted. It changes your life completely. To be in the lowest decile in the most free countries is a lot better than being even the highest decile, not the highest 1%, would live like absolute kings and emperors in such unfree countries. But even the highest decile, the average of that, is lower than the lowest decile in the most free countries. And that's important, in my opinion. So I don't think that more inequality is caused by greater freedom. There's no empirical evidence that that's the case. But then the question is, well, of course, in every society there are people who are unfortunate, unable to care for themselves, and so on. How are they taken care of? And this is still a problem in the unfree societies also. It's not automatic. What institutions are there to care for them? And one author I really highly recommend, who's looked at this question in great detail, two actually, who write in English, David Green, who's a political scientist, and he has several books on the friendly societies. Friendly societies used to be a common institutional arrangement in all over Europe, very strongly entrenched here, of working class people who took care of each other. Ancient Order of the Odd Fellows, all these odd, strange names. They've been largely extinguished by two features. One was the rise of commercial insurance, which had more highly advanced models of actuarial models governing risk and risk pooling. But then other things that were actually probably more significant was the rise of the welfare state. And in Britain, the 1911 passage of the National Health Act, which was an act deliberately aimed by the doctors, British Medical Association, and organized doctors to crush the friendly societies, which were the consumers of medical services. And they wanted to eliminate them and have a political body that they could manipulate more effectively. And as David Green points out, the effect of this was a massive increase in doctors' incomes. shortly thereafter because they dominated this. Similar thing happens in America where doctors take over the state legislatures and pass compulsory medical licensure, which eliminates all the African American medical schools were put out of business, every single one. There was no accident. Restriction of the supply of doctors, and so on and so forth. This was monopoly legislation. But friendly societies are a very effective way to provide social solidarity and the provision of charity, mutual aid, and so on. Some of these still exist, largely as charitable groups of the Masons and the Shriners. You know what those are in the U.S. They sponsor a lot of children's hospitals. Some of the biggest in the United States are sponsored by the Shriners, which is a Masonic order that has lost most of its old functions, but has retained this one, that they actively promote charities. The Prince Hall Masons are a particularly interesting group, established by a man named Prince Hall, who was a Mason, and the Masons are officially anti-racist in their mentality and their order, but some of the Masons still were racist and didn't want to have a black man as a member of their lodge. So he wrote to the Grand Order in Scotland, got a charter, set up a non-racial Masons that would accept everyone. It was mainly African American, but anyone could join. And for a long time, they were a pillar of the African American community, providing social services, moral stability, reinforcement for good behavior, combating alcoholism and drug abuse. If you were an addict, an alcoholic, they would bring you before the group, and so on. And they're almost finished. Actually, where I live in Washington, there used to be a Prince Hall Masonic building, and now it's a Hispanic hip-hop club, which is fine. I work out Hispanic hip-hop clubs, but it's kind of sad that this venerable institution is now gone, and it was for a long time one of the real stabilizing institutions of African American communities. So those institutions that had provided that in the past have now been systematically wiped out. And now you face what they feared. There was a term, the cold hand of public charity, was the term that they used to contrast themselves with the state. And because they offered the warm embrace of the community of members, and their alternative was the cold hand of public charity. And it is no accident that the friendly societies were staunch enemies of socialism in the United Kingdom. Very strong, very important working class enemies of socialism, hated by the socialists. Most of them, you think about the Webbs and so on, were overeducated pinheads who didn't like working class people, said, how dare they criticize our vast social engineering plans. But they were very strong enemies of socialism. Their membership was gigantic, just huge, bigger than the labor union and trade unions movements, but almost nothing has ever been written about them, with the exception of David Green's books in the UK. David Beto, who published in the US a very rich history called From Mutual Aid to the Welfare State, which is published by the University of North Carolina Press. It's a very rich book, and he focuses, because he does African American history largely, on how unbelievably important these institutions were. And in particular, it was the black friendly societies that formed the foundation of the civil rights movement in the U.S. That made possible the organization for black people to stand up for their civil rights. You keep looking at your watch.
Yeah, I was just thinking something about getting pins and needles now. So
anyone should leave. In fact, I'll invite out and I'll buy a round of inexpensive drinks.
Yes, I think we'll head to head. But I think before then, I think you've more than deserved your quick commercial spot.
Yes,
which is actually very important because,
I'd rather not have left that too far.
Yeah, well, I helped out, and I actually have an interest in reducing the number if possible.
Here you are, and they make the commercial pitch.
Yes. Well, I've actually only read, I think, one article in this so far, because it has been available also in critical review. But
It's very good. It's a very important. It's a very important piece discussing some of the most significant philosophy in Oxford at the moment. But I believe this goes quite far. This goes into the history. This does the philosophy and the theory. I don't know what. I mean, actually, I'm going to buy the first
£10.
one anyway. It's £10.
I've read it and I have to say it's excellent, so I highly recommend it, yeah.
Actually, if you're interested, I was told by a friend recently, if you buy two, you could fall asleep twice as fast. But I do have a chapter in which I take apart G.A. Cohen. It did not endear me to him. And some essays on Marxism, on theory of rights, some of the historical questions we were talking about, why liberalism seems to have flourished in some societies and others, issues about inequality and whether markets are characterized by more or less inequality than other social orders, and so on and so forth. You bet.
What do you want us to do, assuming we listen and we agree? What do you want us to do? Do you want civil disobedience or
Disorder,
or what's the best way that we can change?
Change society to be more just, more free, more peaceful.
All the things we talk about.
I'm not a monist in the sense that I think that there's one recipe for every problem, or one thing you should do. It's going to depend on you. I think that it is important. One of the most important things that you can do is one of the most modest, but it really matters. And that is to have some conviction about what is right and wrong, and to speak your mind when you see it being violent. And this has been well documented by sociologists, people who study these sorts of small-scale things. That if someone makes an ugly, racist comment, and one person says, I don't agree with that, I don't like that kind of view, turns out there are a lot of others in the room who will step forward. But if the one person doesn't do it, it won't happen. In cases when there were lynchings, these things have been studied by people carefully, or murders and honor killings and so on. It turns out one person standing up and saying, this is wrong, will change the dynamic entirely. But most people are afraid to do that. So one thing you can do is just say, this is wrong. An example would be something that is very important to me. I don't take any drugs except for two, caffeine and alcohol. One in moderation, the other not. I drink a lot of coffee. a lot of alcohol. But I feel very passionately about the drug war. I think this is one of the most criminal things imposed on our societies today. People who haven't hurt anyone else are brutalized, put in little cages, subjected to all kinds of indignities, in prisons where they then are victimized by drug gangs, by the guards. This is happening in Britain too. It's not just Turkey and the U.S. Everywhere. And then the rest of us are subjected to the violence generated by the rents that go to people who specialize in violence, drug gangs and so on. We don't see drive-by alcohol killings anymore, but we used to when alcohol was killed. Being the person who stands up and says, I think it's time to end the drug war, is what is necessary for it to happen. And even just expressing the view without fear or shame. And for people to say, oh, so you're a drug user. Someone like William Bennett, loathsome, despicable person, former drug czar, former Secretary of Education, U.S. right-wing gas bag. And when Milton Friedman and George Shultz, former Secretary of State, issued a statement it was time to legalize drugs, his response to these two distinguished gentlemen was to say, well, they've obviously been smoking a lot of dope. Loathsome. And fortunately, they stood up to him, and Milton Friedman was very powerful. I once got to see his wife, Rose, who just died, 90-something, light into Attorney General Ed Meese. These are not drug users, the Friedmans. Ancient Jewish economists. And she backed him into a corner She says, Ed Meese, you know the drug war is causing violence, crime, police corruption. You know this, Ed Meese. He said, well, Rose, we have to defend. She said, and then she pulled the ultimate card. Not only was she a PhD economist and mathematician, she was a Jewish grandmother. She said, shame on you, Ed Meese. Shame on you. And that's what we need. And that's an issue I'm very passionate about, is the drug war. And people need to stand up and say, this has to stop. And when enough people in society do that, cowardly, weakly politicians will say, I can promote decriminalization, whatever word they're going to give for it, and move us away from our correctional policy. So that would be a good thing. In other places, I recommend you throw yourself in the bayonets of the state and die valiantly for a noble cause. But even if you don't do that, just standing up and saying what you think is right and being unafraid of the people who will bully you in cases like this, it makes a big difference. Because you'll find out there are other people who are not really one.
Realizing freedom, everybody. That's great. And also, the other thing you should definitely do is come along to our next event, which is Christian Davis talking about the right and duty to tell politically correct jokes. So that will be it will be a small act of bravery.
Actually, I sponsored him when I was president of the Active Civil Liberties Society a long time ago, 1994, and he is an immensely entertaining, interesting sociologist. His specialty is the sociology of jokes and humor. So, who knew there were such people? It's a question of whether academics are productive. But he's a wonderfully interesting speaker.
Yes, same college, lecture room 2. And if anyone is missing one of these pamphlets, which has the rest of our events, do pick one up on your way out. And I think we'll probably go to the old Tom, or across the road. We'll across the road.
Anyone who gets me £10 on my side.